feel like I'm at the console of a submarine here. With the exception of Lansing, Michigan, we're all from Chicago or Milwaukee. And it's nice to see some intermingling between those two cities. We tend not to spend a lot of time together. Actually, you could do a book about the Chicago-Milwaukee relationship. And there was actually a conference at Marquette Law School about 2 years ago, and I did some research and gave a talk about the long relationship. Somewhat one-sided, sort of big brother, little brother is kind of the relationship, but some fascinating contrasts and similarities between the two cities. And my career obviously has been here in Milwaukee, but I try to keep up on the Chicago Polonia as well. And one of my favorite resources is a book called Chicago City of Neighborhoods by Dominic Pasiga, in the back of the room here. And Dominic put together, when did that come out, Dominic? 86? And it was an ambitious work. There were histories of each Chicago neighborhood or neighborhood district, followed by auto tours. And if you have a bicycle, you can also go out on your bike and tour those neighborhoods. So I've done at least 1 day a year on a weekend, either in spring or fall. I'll take my bike down there and poke around Chicago. I think I'm on the third or fourth round of neighborhoods in that cycle. And one of my favorite sections is the Milwaukee Avenue corridor from PRCU, the Polish Museum, down at Augusta, all the way up Milwaukee Avenue Northwest into Ukrainian Village, Wicker Park, Logan Square, and just the heritage there is so dense, so thick with associations. So I've tried to at least educate myself to some degree about Chicago's Polonia as well, and Chicago as a city. Someone in Milwaukee said Chicago is a great town to live 90 miles away from. If we have the advantage of all the resources Chicago has to offer, as well as kind of our own nature, character, personality up here in Milwaukee. So I want to talk about the Milwaukee Polonia.
You want to close it?
Yeah, please.
Okay, or we'll just go ahead.
Talk about the Milwaukee Polonia. And the last census estimate back in 2013 counted roughly 225,000 people who claimed at least some Polish ancestry in the Milwaukee metro area. That would be, if everyone else left, the third largest city in Wisconsin. So about the same size as Madison, Wisconsin, and puts us proportionally in the same category as Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, all these urban centers of Polish settlement. So we have not been by any means the largest group here. That is German and has been from the very start. But people of Polish ancestry have played a huge influence in Milwaukee and continuing in Milwaukee for the last 150 years or so. They were a definite presence by 1870, and the growth accelerated through the end of the 19th century. By 1900, there were roughly 60,000 Polish immigrants and their kids in Milwaukee. About 20% of the metro areas, the cities, then the city, which was the little metro area back in those days, population, now it's about 11% of the metro area. As you know, those numbers are elusive. As you know, Poland was partitioned from 1795 to 1918 by its neighbors. So my ancestors, who come from the agricultural area of Kashubi, up around Bydgoszcz, the papers say Germany as their place of origin, and they had to renounce their allegiance to Kaiser Wilhelm. So even though Polish ethnically, they were in the German state back in those early years. So it was behind the Germans, Milwaukee's Polonia was, and they've always been the majority here, and I mean always, going way back to around 1850. And the Milwaukee Polonia was different from Polonias elsewhere in the United States in a couple of ways. Although they were not pioneers, the Polish immigrants came here early, a little ahead of Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit. And perhaps the more striking contrast was roughly 80% of Milwaukee Polish immigrants came from the German partition. Other cities are kind of distributed between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, largely from the western Poland here in Milwaukee. So they were different from other Polonias and different from other Milwaukee ethnic groups as well. And one of the unwritten laws of life in the American city is that the new groups get the old houses. It's been going on for a really long time and continues to this day. If you're Hmong or from Myanmar or from Somali, Malia, you will probably end up in the older part of town today and only later kind of move out into areas on the edge. And the Poles broke that law, that unwritten law of filtered down housing, way back when they first arrived back in the 1860s. And the receiver neighborhoods, as they're often called, didn't see much of a Polish presence. They jumped over those receiver neighborhoods, especially on the south side, and covered hundreds of blocks with small homes on small lots. And some of the quote, Americans began to take notice back in 1874. This is early in the settlement of Polonia and Milwaukee. The Milwaukee Sentinel described the Poles as sort of this quaint new group who had arrived here and planted a colony. The Sentinel said they have a strong prejudice against paying rent. Usually the first money they can call their own is put into the purchase of a lot. So this is a pattern that they noticed as well. About 14 years later, 1888, there was an article in the Sentinel titled Milwaukee's Poor People. So we're entry level at this stage. And the reporters wrote, the Poles do remarkably well. As a rule, they take good care of themselves. Notwithstanding their low wages, most of them being simply laborers, they manage to live with large families. The first thing they do is to buy a lot on easy payments, then they put up a mere shanty and by get a home of their own. This is the pattern. It's in Buffalo. You can see the same kind of additive architecture you see in Milwaukee, but it's sort of from front to back instead of top to bottom. Talk about the Polish flats here in Milwaukee. And a lot of that, I'm sure, in my case, my ancestors were peasants, and the peasant value was land. That was your wealth. That was your security. Livestock can die. Money can burn. Money can be stolen. But the land itself was your stake in life. So even though they were not large landowners, if they were landowners at all in Poland, they would put what little money they had into a down payment and a little 30-foot wide lot. And on the edge of farmland, just outside the city, on these little 25 or 30-foot wide lots. And the typical pattern was that they would build it without a basement on cedar posts, and in time, as they could afford to, and it might have taken 15 or 20 years, they would jack up that first house and dig a foundation beneath it and have a second living unit there. So either for the extended family or for rental. So the interesting parallel it had, or the impact it had, was even though they had not been landowners of any size in Poland, here they became not only landowners, but if they had a Polish flat, as it was called, to rent, they were landlords as well. So it had an impact on the psychology as well as the economy of the Polish families who made their homes here. There were actually 3 Polonias in Milwaukee. The largest was on the south side. I'll talk about that more at length. There was another on the east side of Milwaukee, just south of here, and Susan Mikosh has done a study of the East Village in her occupation as an anthropologist. And that was the area right around, if you know Milwaukee at all, around Brady and Humboldt on the Lower East Side. And the attraction there was jobs in Milwaukee's first industrial district along the Milwaukee River. And the church was, as in every community, the hub, the heart, the centerpiece around which everything revolved. And the church there was St. Hedwig's on Humboldt and Brady. It goes back to 1871, and that was the second church in Milwaukee. And that pretty much kept time for that neighborhood, which was called Kępa Kaszubów, which is the island of the Kaszubs. You know, a lot of people came from, some fishermen, talk about that in a bit, but a lot more mainland agriculturalists who came and made their homes on Milwaukee's Lower East Side. You also had 2 other settlements, the South Side and Jones Island. I'll talk about them at greater length. And the South Side, that's what you came through if you came from Chicago this morning. And when you got into the older part of town, you saw this really big church kind of yawning over the freeway to your left with a copper dome that's gradually turning green. That's St. Joseph's Basilica. Talk about that in a bit. But that's the heart of the South Side Polonia. And it is residential purely, but it is surrounded by industry. The Menominee Valley, which is the line dividing downtown Milwaukee and the west side from everything to the south, at one time was the largest concentration of factory jobs in the entire state of Wisconsin. Tens of thousands of jobs in that valley, like the Cuyahoga in Cleveland. So it was kind of the Ruhr Valley of Milwaukee. And on the south, you have a railroad line, Chicago Northwestern, and to the west there was a malt belt, so a lot of malt plants there. To the south, other factories, and to the east, the Kinnickinnick Valley was industrial as well. So you had people able to walk to jobs in these local industries, or take the streetcar if they were feeling especially flush, but more than use shoe leather to get to work. And you have these small homes on small lots, punctuated by neighborhood businesses. And the census was done back in 1895, and they found on the near south side, Polonia, 73 Polish grocers, 51 Polish butchers, and 164 Polish saloon keepers. So that was sort of the neighborhood communal spot. And that was true of all the working class neighborhoods in Milwaukee and elsewhere, Chicago I'm sure as well. They were communal living rooms, kind of the working man's club as it was put. And in some ways the secular equivalent of a church, not to be too sacrilegious, but these were centers of neighboring, centers of community. And one of the lines you would hear quite often is, if you drink, you'll get to know your neighbors, because these were the places where people would congregate, and centers of neighboring for a lot of the sections, small sections in the south side of Polonia as elsewhere. And you also had along the area called Mitchell Street, which today is largely Latino, and it's a really interesting transformation of the south side. That was called in some circles the Polish Grand Avenue, because Milwaukee's Main Street is Wisconsin Avenue, which was called Grand Avenue, and that was the major shopping strip. And there were 5 theaters there. There were at least 7 wedding gown emporiums along Mitchell Street. And the profile is almost like a small town or small city. And I can recall growing up, people would talk about going shopping downtown. They didn't mean downtown Milwaukee. They meant Mitchell Street. That was the place of commerce for generations of Polish Southsiders. And the area just south of Mitchell Street was called the 14th Ward. It was by far the densest, most densely settled ward in Milwaukee around 1900. Also had the highest parochial school attendance in Milwaukee. 75% of the kids in that neighborhood went to parochial schools, and you know what that meant, Polish Catholic schools in that neighborhood. And I haven't been able to verify, but there was actually one public school that was said to have closed down for lack of enrollment, because there was so much pressure to fill up those schools organized by the Polish Catholic congregations. So by 1900, roughly 57% of the south side's population was Polish. So one of the more densely settled Polonias in all of urban America. And incredibly dense. My own grandmother was raised on 14th Street. Her name was actually Hefta, so sounds German, but they were Kashubs and had kind of this sort of German-Polish hybridization going on there. But she was certainly Polish by ancestry. Her father died when she was 8 years old, leaving her mother to raise 6 kids on a washerwoman's wages. And what kept that family together was they had managed to purchase on this little 30-foot wide lot. They had 2 homes, and between them 5 units in those 2 homes, rather small. And she recalled as a kid growing up, there were 27 kids on her lot. 3 baseball teams on her lot. And that was fairly typical of the density you saw in that part of Milwaukee's Polonia. So what had begun as a dense neighborhood became even denser. And on the other end of the scale, and this is really the signature of the Polonia landscape, you have these really big churches. So small homes, large churches. And they came from the same people. It never fails to knock me out. They also tell a story, and they are benchmarks in the growth of the Milwaukee Polonia, kind of a family tree. And the first was St. Stanislaus back in 1866, which is 1 year before St. Stanislaus in Chicago was established. So this was the first Polish church in any American city. So not by much, but the first in the American Polonia. And they began in the Walker's Point neighborhood, moved down to where they are still on 5th and Mitchell in 1872. And that was the mother church for more than 20 congregations that you can kind of follow the steeples if you want to see where the Polonia expanded. So in the South Side's case, you can follow with that anchor of St. Stan's on 5th and Mitchell, follow on to St. Hyacinth on 14th and Beecher, where my grandmother was raised back in 1882, on to St. Vincent de Paul and St. Josephat's, both founded back in 1888, and on out into the edge of the suburbs as time passed. There are more than 20 in Milwaukee County, Polish Catholic churches, the largest number on Milwaukee's near south side. And they were impressive not just in numbers, and the basilica itself was really a remarkable achievement. Again, it's that big copper dome you saw coming into Milwaukee from the south if you came from Chicago. That congregation, as I said, got going back in 1888, and that parish had roughly 12,000 members by 1900. It was a city, basically a city back in those years, and probably the largest congregation of any faith in the entire state. So the pastor of the church, a former blacksmith named Father Wilhelm Gurda in the old country, decided he would build a church that would hold them all, and hired an architect named Erhard Brielmeier, German, to design what was basically a scaled-down version of St. Peter's in Rome. You could probably put 3 or 4 St. Josephat's into St. Peter's in Rome, but it's still the biggest church in Milwaukee, capacity of roughly 2,000 people. And they broke ground in 1896, and they finished it in 1901, and here's a Milwaukee-Chicago connection. The story was that Father Gurda had commissioned Brielmeier to design a building that was brick and terracotta. And to try to save money for the parish building committee, he thought he'd go to the larger market of Chicago and shop for bricks. While he was there, he learned that they were tearing down the Chicago Post Office and Custom House in Chicago, which was flawed from the day the doors opened. He bought the whole thing for a reported $20,000 and loaded up on 500 flat cars, all the salvage material. And Brielmeier didn't flinch. He just designed, redesigned, redrew his plans from what had been brick and terracotta to stone, Indiana limestone. And so it's a green building. It is LEED platinum because the entire thing is recycled. It's all the stone from Chicago as well as the brass railings and a lot of the decorative touches. So if you have a chance to get inside there, it is well worth the effort. It is certainly on the European scale in terms of its artistic finish as well as its size. I was on the board there, the foundation, for 21 years. We have tours in there, and people would say, why do I go to Europe? And you go to Europe, obviously, because you want to see it. But you have Europe kind of in the midst of the south side Polonia, and it's been well taken care of. The fundraising campaign continues to go on, sort of the never-ending campaign for a building that size, but it is just an incredible monument of both faith and peoplehood. And today it serves kind of a metropolitan congregation, people from every zip code in Milwaukee, but still very heavily from the neighborhood. And I'll talk more about the changes in that neighborhood as I conclude. And sometimes we tend to romanticize what life was like for our ancestors, sort of these hardy folks who come from the old country with nothing and work their way up from the bottom and succeed in America. Life was hard. Life was difficult for our ancestors. And you see that clearly in some of the numbers from St. Josephat's back around 1900. They averaged, this is a young community, they averaged 475 baptisms a year, an average of more than 1 a day. So these were people having kids and having large numbers of kids. And the school itself, at one time around 1900, had roughly 1,500 students, sitting 3 to a desk in some cases. So the density of the neighborhood was kind of reflected in the density of the school. And one more figure illustrates how difficult things were. In the years between 1900 and 1920, 60% of the funerals of St. Josephat's were said in white vestments. What does that mean? It means kids. This was an appallingly high rate of infant mortality, child mortality. So this was, you did not assume that your kids were going to survive to be viable to an age where they're even in school. So imagine the heartache in that neighborhood and elsewhere throughout the Polonias and the rest of the United States. So you have that continuing congregation of steeples in the south side Polonia, still one of the things that sets us apart. But then there's a really unusual section of Milwaukee that was the third Polonia, along with the east side and the south side, And that was Jones Island that you did not see if you came in from Chicago, from the south. It's the area along the Milwaukee Harbor, and it's where the sewage treatment plant is, the Port of Milwaukee, and the Dan Hone Bridge, which connects the heart of Milwaukee with the Bayview neighborhood and our southern suburbs. And that was a windswept peninsula back in the 1870s when a man named Jacob Muja came from Kashubi, from the Hell Peninsula, Yastarnia, know that area, if you know the area in northern Kashubi. And they were fisher people in the old country, and Muja arrives on this land that looks just like the Hell Peninsula. So the town at the very end is Hell. Welcome to Hell, is what they say when you get to the town at the very end there, past the military installation. And he said, we can fish here, and began to recruit people from the old country. And before long, you had this settlement of fisher folk, again, large families settling on Jones Island. By 1875, there were roughly 12 houses. By 1900, there were more than 300. And the population peaked around that year at roughly 1,600 people. Now, no one lives there. This is a non-residential in the extreme, and something of a wasteland residentially, although well used. Everything from port facilities to treating our sewage. There were other groups there, including Germans, some Scandinavians, but by far the largest was people from the Hell Peninsula in Kashubi. So the Kashubs were rather, as you know, a rather different kind of a subgroup in the Polish state, Polish nation. And Jones Island was probably the closest thing Milwaukee's ever known to a genuine urban village. In most cases, our ancestors came from the old country with agricultural backgrounds and worked in factories. So it was just a complete transformation from what they had known to what they came to know in the U.S. The Jones Islanders, by contrast, continued a way of life they had known for centuries in the homeland. So it really was kind of a slice of Europe in the heart of Milwaukee. And they would bring up roughly 1,000 tons of fish in an average year: trout, whitefish, sturgeon back in those years, perch, chubs, herring, and others. So that was a very important source of protein for people of all backgrounds in the Milwaukee area. The Jones Island community looked different from other sections of Milwaukee. There was no grid system, despite what some of the maps here in the AGS would have you believe. The figment of the map maker's imagination. They wandered everywhere. They were technically squatters. They did not, in many cases, pay for their lots. It was kind of a very informal system of land division, and the houses tended to be rather improvised, like the streets that kind of wandered unpredictably. And they used driftwood that was abundant for fences as well as for firewood, and used water holes for at least washing water. And they were isolated, certainly, but they had a strong sense of community, in part because of that isolation. You had communal bonfires and clam bakes, a baseball team of the Islanders, and the Fishermen's Chorus that would perform concerts on the mainland. So there was some intermingling. They did have some city services, although they paid no taxes. In 1896, a public school was established on the island, and the teachers were rowed out from the mainland to teach in the Jones Island School. And on Sunday morning, morning like this morning, they would have rowed across the Kinnickinnick Basin from Jones Island to Church of St. Stanislaus Church. And to this day, there is a rood beam above, sort of crowning above the sanctuary, that was given by the Kashub fishermen in thanksgiving for deliverance from a storm. So they are permanently written into the record of St. Stan's. So it was an easy community to romanticize, rustic and quaint. So there would be these regular processions of artists who would come out to Jones Island on sketching trips. It also drew fun seekers, people from the mainland. And there were two sort of patriarchs of the community named Plambeck and Konski. And they smoked fish, and they may have begun the institution of the Milwaukee fish fry. And you'd have beer barons, other industrialists, as well as normal Milwaukeeans coming out from downtown for a fish fry on Friday night, and kind of a walk on the wild side. You know, if they happened to get there in time for a Kashub wedding, which lasted 3 days, they might have sort of witnessed a real cultural spectacle. Some would perhaps be overserved There were at one time roughly 13 saloons on Jones Island at a community of roughly 1,600 people, so a rather high density. And if the people from the mainland sort of got out of hand, they would be kind of taken in hand and put on the nearest rowboat and ferried back to land and said, don't come back. So it was a kind of a self-enforcing, kind of a social system. So this was a really interesting part of Milwaukee. So I did my master's thesis here at UWM on Jones Island. And you have, the location there was too prime to be ignored for other land uses. It was a human beehive in the midst of a rapidly developing industrial city. And the real death knell began when there was an action on the part of a rolling mill, Illinois Steel. There was one down in South Chicago and one here in Milwaukee, another one in Detroit. And their plant was on the south end of Jones Island, and as the ships got larger, they wanted better docking facilities, so they claimed by prior title the Jones Island property, and the result was a court case that lasted for years. And among the defenders there was a man named Victor Berger, who was Milwaukee's socialist patriarch, and our socialist congressman from Milwaukee for many years. And finally, as the need of the harbor got too urgent to ignore, and the need for sewage treatment got too urgent to ignore, the city condemned the land back in 1914 and made Jones Island the center, the location for both the port and the sewage treatment plant. And a little story about how widely respected Jones Island was when they were talking about where they should put the sewage treatment plant in the port of Milwaukee. They said we should put it on Jones Island, and the quote from the report was, because of its isolation and especially its remoteness from residential districts. This was a residential district. This was a village. But the fact that it was looked at with such little respect by mainland authorities kind of gives you some idea of how easy it was to kind of push that aside. The big difference when the city condemned it back in 1914 is that the city paid the islanders. The steel company had not offered to. So they began to leave. By 1920, there were 25 families left. By 1922, there were a half dozen. So what had been a beehive of 1,600 people was down to just a half dozen families. The last man standing was Captain Felix Struck, who was born on the island and had his own kind of fishing rigs, fishing center on the west side of the island. And he was removed back in 1943 during World War II for what they called reasons of port security. All this war material is going out to the port of Milwaukee. He was no threat, but they decided that they would lock it down. And he died 6 months after moving from Jones Island, so left the island, and that kind of ended his life as well. And the landmark on Jones Island today is a little park, perhaps the smallest in Milwaukee. It is roughly, it's about half the size of the area enclosed by these four pillars. So it's just shoehorned into the west side of the island, called Kashub's Park, and it is the site where Captain Felix Struck's last stand was. By the time Felix Struck left in 1943, the mainland Polonia, both east side and south side, was on the verge of major change. There had not been much going on in the 30s and 40s. Depression and World War II pretty much put everything on ice. But after the war, you had this huge migration, same pattern in Chicago, same pattern in Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, people moving from the old Polonias out into the suburban fringe. And in Milwaukee's case, this was places like Franklin, Greenfield, Oak Creek, Greendale, which to this day are between 20 and 30% people of Polish ancestry. So the source is the old South Side, but they moved out into what had been farmland. My own family, my grandparents had a hardware store on Lincoln Avenue for 50 years, from 1915 to 1965. We lived a few blocks south. In 1955, like a lot of South Side Poles, my father and mother took us up Forest Home Avenue to Hales Corners, and we lived right behind a Catholic church called St. Mary's that was on what had been known as Kelly Hill, and the pastor when we got there was Thomas Patrick Trahey, and they celebrated St. Patrick's Day with enthusiasm. Within 10 years, the pastor was Father Francis Drabanovich, and you have this large Polish contingent in the local school. And that was certainly a strong pattern in that entire neighborhood, the entire south side of Milwaukee. As you have this migration out to the edge, you also have some profound changes going on in the old south side Polonia. And the largest of those was the arrival of Latinos, especially Mexicans, beginning in the 1920s, who were recruited in many cases by labor agents who went down to Mexico or to border towns and offered any adult male who wanted a job free passage, free housing, and they began on the near south side, and in time kind of moved out from company, essentially barracks, into the area around the tanneries on the south end of the 6th Street Bridge, which is why if you want good Mexican food in Milwaukee, you go to Walker's Point. You go to that neighborhood. And as time